This has been really, really awesome. Thanks to all the speakers who spoke today. And we have one more amazing speaker today. And I was really excited because I am a fan of retro chiptune music. So when I heard that someone wanted to talk about all of this sort of thing, I was very excited. So Rich VREELAND is going to talk about these excellent tones. He's known as Disaster Piece. I like that name. Ooh, I'm not a bass, so I can't announce Disaster Piece. Award-winning freelance composer, sound designer. He lives in Berkeley, California, with a focus in producing and directing dynamic sound treatments for games. He grew up in New York. Okay. Clacking rhythms on his teeth. What does your dentist have to say about that?
He's not happy.
No. And writing guitar licks, eventually graduating from Berklee College of Music with a bachelor's of music in music synthesis. That's awesome. Along the way, he's interned with MIT Game Lab, written original music for franchises like Bomberman. Oh my God, I love Bomberman. And developed a critically acclaimed generative music tool. So, without further ado, Rich, come and talk to us about chiptunes.
Cool. So this is going to be kind of short and sweet. I had a somewhat different original plan for this talk, and this kind of came at me at the last second, so I decided to switch it up. So this is a pretty music-centric talk, but hopefully there'll be some crossover for any of you folks who are producers or artists or programmers. Chipmunk? That's what my mom calls chiptunes. She doesn't really get the name, but so what is chip music exactly? Some people call it 8-bit music or chiptunes or retro video game music, and any of those titles I think bring to mind essentially the same thing: music born from the technical limitation of early video game hardware. And any subjective differences in belief about what constitutes chip music are not really the point of this talk, so I won't say much more about that. But why is this chip music? Why is it so popular? The relatively slow rate at which sound technology in games has improved through the 80s and even the early 90s, I think is largely responsible for the well-established aesthetic of music in games that we continue to hear even today. And while the Super Nintendo brought newer technology like sampled sound to the forefront in the 90s, and other limitations such as memory availability and voice limits still persisted. And while the introduction of disc consoles, like the Sega CD, brought with it CD audio, music limited to a handful of voices as a matter of necessity has continued on in handhelds well into the 21st century. So as a result of being limited in some very consistent ways for many, many years, methods for creating this particular style of music have been established and passed on, ensuring that the essence of chip music continues even when the limitations have been lifted. So I think as we've moved past the necessity to create music in this style, we've moved into the realm now where people can impose limitations on themselves as a creative possibility. I'm not trying to convince everybody to go home and start making bleeps and bloops, but I think as general artistic advice, working within a self-inflicted framework has profound consequences, or can have profound consequences. And knowing the rules of the game ahead of time means less time spent figuring out those rules and more time creating. It also means working more closely with fewer parameters, which means a new side of your creativity can be given the chance to shine through. So, for even the most seasoned composer, the nuances of making chip music are pretty easy to miss. It took me years to even realize that it wasn't all played back at one volume level. And I've heard some contemporary music done in this style by accomplished film composers that the music is compositionally very good, but manages to be aesthetically flatter than a lot of chip music from the 80s, which is kind of interesting. And I think this stems from a lack of understanding of how to make the most of those limitations. The general aesthetic is pretty easy to replicate, but there's more to it than that, and it goes pretty deep. It can be a rabbit hole for sure. I think the limited capabilities of the sound hardware actually allowed composers to spend less time on recording, mixing, and instrumentation, and more time on the second-to-second details of composition and production. Because the modern music environment of software like Logic or Ableton or Pro Tools is so far removed from what chip music was originally made with, it can be easy to gloss over some of the most crucial elements of that sound. But it's not like the game composers of the 80s had it in the bag either. It took time for the process of working within these limitations to refine itself, which not only included the ability of the composer, but also his or her access to composing tools. It was commonplace for music to be written outside of the system, like on a keyboard or recorded, and then given over to a programmer to be transcribed into game data. And the programmer may or may not have had any music abilities of his own, so that was a process that evolved over time. So for reference purposes, I want to play 3 clips. One from the beginning of the NES console cycle in 1983, one from 1990, which was kind of the prime of the NES, and then one from 2010, which was written by a hobbyist without having to worry about sharing memory with code and graphics. But all 3 songs use the exact same hardware limitations. So this is the one from 1983. So that one's pretty simple. Does anyone know what that's from?
Donkey Kong?
It's Mario Brothers.
The original.
Yeah. This one's from 1990. That one's from Silver Surfer. So just in I think it took time to sort of for these composers to kind of understand the limitations that they were working with and to exploit the rules. I was going to play. Well, I guess I will play the third one. Yeah, I mean the limitations have remained unchanged. Okay, I'll play this third one here. Okay, so you get the idea. I think the takeaway is that you can do some pretty multi-dimensional stuff with limitations that may seem draconian at first. Yeah. So one of the interesting things about working within limitations is that the byproduct of that can be these techniques that come out of it that are circumstantial, that are completely a result of being forced to work within a box. And by being in that box, you're forced to think outside of that box and try to solve problems in ways you wouldn't normally do so. And I think in that way it can help you focus. This is something as contemporary composers can be really easy to forget about when you're loading up your DAW of choice with your 96-track template that you've already made and the hundreds of sample libraries and plugins you've bought. I know I've definitely been guilty of this from time to time. So I want to just share some circumstantial techniques that came out of retro game music that I think are pretty cool, and are a result of trying to do more with less. So this is probably the most classic example, the C64 Arpeggio. The Commodore 64 had some features that made it sound more sophisticated than the NES, things like filters and full pulse width modulation. However, the C64 sound chip, or the SID chip as it's known, had only 3 channels to the NES's 5. And if you want to have bass, drums, melody, and backing chords fit into 3 channels of sound, you need to be creative. So as a way to fake the sound of playing chords, some clever folks started adding very quick arpeggios to their songs that would repeatedly play a series of chord tones. And the technique can be so effective that you can be doped into hearing the arpeggios as a polyphonic sound. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but for the sake of thoroughness, here's a clip of that. Funny little tune. This is a pretty cool one, filling in the cracks. When you only have a handful of voices, every moment of silence in the music is an opportunity to flesh out the production of your sound or introduce a new supporting element. One example is to mimic the sound of delay and reverb. So many composers would use the available spaces in between the notes to generate facsimiles that could suggest the sound of a delay or a reverb unit without actually being one. And it also gave you the freedom to kind of do interesting things because you're manually putting in all those notes. It's not unheard of to use a single audio channel to convey more than one instrument part at the same time. And I have an example to prove it. I've conveniently chosen one of my own songs to demo. It's a 30-second piece of NES music I wrote for Bit Trip Runner 2. So I'll play it, and then I'll solo a single channel so you can hear all the different parts that are happening. Hopefully, it's a little confusing, but. And this is just one of those channels soloed. So it's really kind of like an interesting process to be limited, to be so limited. It totally changes the way that you write music. And for me, I find to go back to that from time to time, it's really refreshing and kind of gives me new perspective on my work. To be able to be like, oh, I have to sort of figure out how to make this all fit together like a puzzle. So this is one more. It's pulse width modulation. Is already or had already been a prominent feature of synthesizers for a while, but on the Nintendo, you were only limited to 4 widths, and that, along with the lack of access to other timbres, they're triangle wave and noise outside of that. It makes for some fairly interesting cases where composers would use these to create different sounds. So there's this video that someone put together on YouTube that I wanted to share with you guys. Oh, whoops. Yeah, so it's pretty self-explanatory, I guess. Yeah, so I guess the takeaway is to challenge yourself, to limit yourself. I think it can be very beneficial to your work, or at least for me, it's been very beneficial for me. These are cool little tricks and techniques that people have picked up over time. But I think working within limitations sometimes can have widespread application in other areas. And at the very least, you learn lessons about yourself and about your work. So yeah, why not give yourself a chance to put a different aspect of your creativity under the microscope and learn something new in the process? Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, or not.
How did you come up with your name, Disaster Piece?
It was supposed to be a play on masterpiece, and then I changed piece to peace. Yeah.
When you're creating chiptune stuff, do you use actual chips, or I know there's also it's not a sample library, but it's something you can buy that actually mimics the emulator, and it mimics the sounds of all the different chips.
Yeah, there's a lot of different resources for that. There's for people who like to who want to do chip music, but they don't want to leave the comfort of their DAW. There's an instrument called Chip Sounds, which is like a multi-instrument that has pretty good samples of all the different sound chips from the 80s. For the example that I played when I wrote music for Bit Trip Runner, I used FamiTracker, which is an NES tracker that will actually compile to an NES cartridge. Which is pretty rad. So you get to kind of have the experience of writing the authentic music, but with a tool that's contemporary. So it's a little less brutal to actually write the music. Yeah.
What would be the best place for an absolute beginner to just start, like best site or best YouTube channel or anything like that?
I would definitely recommend checking out FamiTracker. Even if you've never used a music tracker before, I think it's probably one of the most user-friendly trackers that you can try, and it's free. So if you Google that, FamiTracker, it'd be a good thing to check out. Cool. Thank you, guys.